There are streets in New York where the ground feels finished, paved, mapped, named, priced. And there are streets where the ground has never been finished, only covered. 53rd Street in Brooklyn was once one of those places, a simple numbered corridor in a borough built on fill, clay, old shorelines, and the private decisions of engineers whose names do not survive in public memory. The station that carried the name 53rd Street did not live long enough to become famous. It did not become a postcard station or an architectural landmark or a place of civic pride. It became something else, a location that transit workers spoke about in fragments, a stop that appeared and disappeared in internal documents, a piece of infrastructure that finally ceased to exist in concrete. The title that remains, shut down due to tunnel instability, Brooklyn, now demolished, reads like a clean administrative summary. It is clean in the way a medical chart can be clean. It does not describe the sounds. To understand why a station can vanish, you begin with purpose. Brooklyn's rapid transit expansions were not built as singular monuments. They were built as flowing systems meant to absorb commuters, reroute pressure, and serve new housing blocks that rose faster than the bedrock could be surveyed. A station like 53rd Street existed because someone calculated a need for it. Ridership projections, neighborhood growth, transfer patterns, the distance between stops. The platform was never meant to be a destination. It was meant to be a valve. In the archive, a station is first a line item, a planned length of platform, a scheduled opening, a budget that tolerates certain unknowns. Those unknowns are usually underground. In Brooklyn, the underground is rarely stable in the way Manhattan's schists can be stable. Here, you encounter glacial deposits, soft pockets, old creek beds forced into pipes, and the man-made layers of a city that has been leveled and rebuilt repeatedly. In an engineering drawing, unstable ground is a hatched area, a note, a contingency. In a tunnel, it is the long-term question: what happens when the ground does not behave like the drawing? A station named for a street is a promise: you will be able to stop here reliably. The horror, in its most practical form, begins when a promise like that becomes conditional. Transit systems are full of conditional truth that riders never see. A train is safe if the rail stays aligned. The rail stays aligned if the ties do their job. The ties do their job if the ballast drains. The ballast drains if the tunnel lining stays intact. The lining stays intact if water does not find a path. Water does not find a path if the city's surface and subsurface systems remain separate. In New York, they rarely remain separate for long. When the first serious concerns about tunnel instability appear in a station's story, they do not arrive as dramatic revelations. They arrive as maintenance notes, recurring leaks, hairline cracks, spalling concrete, a pattern of dampness that refuses to map neatly to weather. They arrive as the repeated replacement of components that should not need repeated replacement, signal cables that corrode too quickly, conduits that sweat, fasteners that rust in months rather than years. At first, a station can live with those problems. New York is built on living with problems. The system's muscle memory is to compensate, schedule extra inspections, install temporary shielding, patch and paint, pump and drain. The rider sees nothing except a darker ceiling and the faint chemical smell of fresh sealant. But the station begins to develop a second life, an internal reputation. 53rd Street Station became known, quietly, for the way its tunnel sounded. People who worked it described a low mechanical resonance that seemed to come from the wall itself, as if the tunnel had a voice independent of the trains. It was the kind of observation that does not fit in a report. There are no official categories for the wall hums. The closest bureaucratic vocabulary is vibration, ground-borne noise, resonance, harmonics. Those words reduce experience to measurement, but measurement was the problem. Measurements taken on certain nights did not match what workers said they felt. This is how such stories begin, not with a collapse, but with a discrepancy between lived reality and recorded data. Brooklyn's underground is also crowded. Above a tunnel, there may be water mains, gas lines, electrical vaults, communication ducts, the buried remnants of older infrastructures that were never fully removed. Beneath it, there may be saturated soil that shifts under load. A station is not an isolated object. It is a negotiated space between competing systems. If one system fails, the others inherit the consequences. A station threatened by instability forces a transit authority to choose between two public narratives. One is routine maintenance, closures framed as planned repairs, inconvenience as a sign of responsibility. The other is structural doubt, the admission that something beneath the city has become uncertain. That admission carries risk, political, financial, psychological. Riders tolerate delays. They do not tolerate the idea that the tunnel itself may not be trustworthy. So when a station begins to fail, the language that surrounds it tightens. Notices become more general, less descriptive. Reports circulate in fewer hands. The station remains open, then opens only during certain hours, then becomes a point trains pass through without stopping. To the rider, it feels like an adjustment. To the system, it is a slow retreat. There are contemporary examples of tunnel closures in New York framed as repair work rather than existential weakness. The MTA has repeatedly shut down the 53rd Street tunnel connecting Queens and Manhattan for repairs, impacting E and M service. Public coverage describes planned closures for maintenance and repairs, carefully bounded in time and scope, CBS New York, ABC 7 NY. Those stories are familiar to New Yorkers. The system breaks, the system fixes itself, life continues. A station shut down due to tunnel instability, then demolished, belongs to a different category. It cannot be neatly bounded. Demolition is not maintenance. Demolition is surrender. When a station is demolished, it is not always because the structure is dangerous to the city at large. Sometimes demolition is an accounting decision. Remove a liability, simplify a corridor, eliminate the need for inspections and staffing, seal an entrance that attracts trespassers. But the stated reason here is tunnel instability. That phrase implies something more intrusive, something that cannot be solved with new tiles or fresh lighting. It implies movement. Movement underground is the kind of thing humans are trained to ignore until it becomes undeniable. The city moves constantly in microscopic ways: thermal expansion, vibration, traffic load, seasonal groundwater shifts. Engineers build for that. The fear begins when the movement stops being periodic and starts being directional, when cracks propagate in a way that suggests stress is not being relieved but transferred, when water finds new paths, carving and carrying fine material away, leaving voids that do not announce themselves until they are large enough to matter. The early unease around 53rd Street Station was not a single dramatic incident. It was the sense repeated by different people over time that the tunnel did not feel like it was resting. Some described the platform as if it were slightly off level, the way a room feels when a picture frame refuses to hang straight. Others noted that the dampness was not random, but patterned. One section of wall always wet, another always dry, as if the tunnel were being fed by an unseen shoelet with a consistent schedule. There were also the small anomalies that do not make sense until later, the occasional faint grit on the platform that reappeared after cleaning, a distinct metallic smell in the air on mornings after heavy rain that did not correspond to any known chemical treatment, a recurring malfunction in a particular signal segment that technicians could reset but not permanently cure, and always the sound. Trains entering the station with their normal roar, then a momentary change in pitch, as if the tunnel were narrowing imperceptibly, forcing the acoustics to compress. Riders did not name this. Riders rarely name what they cannot verify. They only felt it and then forgot it, because forgetting is how cities remain functional. The documentary record of a station like this is rarely complete. Transit authorities document what they must. Contractors document what they are paid to document. Frontline workers document what keeps them safe and employed. Everything else survives as oral residue, a warning passed from a senior maintainer to a new hire, a phrase like, "Don't linger by that wall," a habit of walking quickly through a certain cross passage without knowing why. In this story, the unease is not the presence of something unknown, it is the presence of something known but unspoken, that the tunnel was changing and the people closest to it could not persuade the system to describe the change plainly. The first part of the station's life is defined by its intended normalcy, a street name, a platform, a routine, and beneath it, a ground that refuses to be routine. What came later, warnings that hardened into procedure, procedure that hardened into closure, began with decisions so small they appeared harmless. A bolt tightened, a patch applied, a log entry made with neutral language, a request for additional time denied, a leak classified as manageable, an inspection rescheduled. A station can survive on that kind of management for years. Sometimes it survives indefinitely. 53rd Street Station did not. The technical problem with tunnel instability is that it rarely announces itself in the way the public imagines. People think of a sudden collapse, a dramatic crater, a subway swallowed in a single night. That does happen, but it is not the common pathway. More often, instability is a slow negotiation between water, soil, load, and fatigue. It is the gradual transformation of a structure from something that holds its shape to something that must be continually persuaded to keep holding it. In Brooklyn, persuasion is often made of steel ribs, grout injections, and constant pumping. A subway tunnel is not simply a hole in the ground. It is a system of linings, waterproofing, drainage paths, electrical systems, and maintenance access points. It is also a boundary. It separates the controlled interior of transit from the uncontrolled exterior of the city. When that boundary becomes porous, the tunnel stops being a closed environment and becomes an interface with water-ground chemistry, surface contamination, and pressure cycles that engineers can model but cannot fully predict. The earliest recorded warnings about the 53rd Street corridor did not use the phrase instability. They used safer words: water intrusion, degradation, recurring settlement indicators. These terms sound clinical. They are clinical, but in practice, they describe a tunnel that is being slowly reshaped by forces outside of it. In certain segments, workers noted efflorescence, white mineral deposits blooming on concrete where water evaporates and leaves salts behind. Efflorescence is common in old infrastructure. It is also a map. It shows where water is traveling, where it pauses, where it is forced through microfractures. When efflorescence thickens over time, it suggests that water is not merely visiting, it is using the tunnel as part of its route. Water is rarely alone. It brings fine particles with it. In soft ground, those particles can be carried away through tiny openings, a process that can create voids beyond the tunnel lining. Void formation is one of the quietest forms of danger in underground construction because it can grow without visible damage until the lining loses support. The lining is designed to distribute load. If there is nothing behind it, distribution becomes stress. Engineers measure this. They install telltales across cracks, strain gauges on structural elements, and settlement markers at the surface. They compare readings over time. They try to determine whether the tunnel is stable, stabilizing, or drifting toward failure. But measurement is not as objective as it seems. It depends on placement, on maintenance of instruments, on interpretation. A gauge can fail. A marker can be disturbed by street work. Data can be averaged, smoothed, or explained away by seasonal variation. And in a system as large as New York's, data competes with priorities. If the tunnel is not currently failing, it becomes one of many concerns, waiting its turn.
In the 53rd Street station area, the pattern that unsettled some workers was not a single alarming number. It was the way different indicators did not agree. Surface settlement markers showed little to no change over long periods, yet inside the tunnel, hairline cracking increased in certain locations, and maintenance crews reported a subtle shift in track geometry that required more frequent tamping and alignment checks than adjacent segments.
Track geometry does not drift without cause. In tunnels, drift often points to differential movement, one side of the structure moving slightly differently than the other, or the invert, the bottom of the tunnel, lifting or settling unevenly. Even millimeters matter. Trains are heavy, repetitive loads. A minor misalignment becomes a cyclical udar, a repeated strike. Over time, it can amplify vibration and accelerate wear, feeding back into the very structure that supports the rails. This is how instability becomes self-sustaining. The overlooked flaw, according to internal accounts, was not an obvious construction error like missing reinforcement. It was an assumption about the ground's behavior, an assumption inherited from older surveys and reinforced by the pressure to keep projects moving. Brooklyn's subsurface is notoriously variable. You can bore through relatively firm material for a block, then encounter a seam of soft, saturated soil that behaves like a different world. Tunnels built through such transitions require careful treatment at the interface, additional support, careful waterproofing, and constant monitoring. In the 53rd Street segment, the interface was not treated as an interface, it was treated as continuity. The lining design did not change sharply enough. Drainage assumptions did not change sharply enough. It was not a catastrophic mistake. It was a small mischaracterization that became significant only years later when the city above changed. Surface change matters. New developments alter load patterns. Street reconstruction alters drainage paths. Water mains replaced or repaired alter local groundwater. Even the installation of new utilities can create preferential flow paths. The tunnel beneath does not have to be directly touched for its environment to change. Around the period when the first serious concerns surfaced, Brooklyn saw cycles of heavy street work in multiple neighborhoods, utility replacements, roadbed excavations, and construction activity that, in aggregate, changed the way water moved. When a large trench is cut and backfilled, it can become a conduit. Water finds the easier path. That path can end at a tunnel. Workers began to notice that leaks worsened after specific types of surface activity, not just after rain. There were reports that the tunnel walls sweated in predictable patterns. After certain nights, after certain weekends, the pattern did not match weather. It matched human schedules. The technical teams responded as they always do. They grouted, they injected sealants, they installed new drainage channels, they replaced corroded components, they patched. Each intervention improved conditions temporarily, then the same conditions returned, often slightly shifted. In maintenance culture, this creates a particular kind of fatigue, not physical fatigue, though that exists, but cognitive fatigue, the erosion of confidence that a fix will remain a fix. Crews begin to treat the tunnel as an adversary rather than an asset. They begin to expect reoccurrence. They begin to approach the work with a kind of controlled distrust. And there were the strange patterns that had no engineering explanation at first. Reports of small, repeated signal anomalies concentrated in a narrow range near the station, not system-wide, not random. The signal system, in theory, should be isolated from moisture through conduits and enclosures, but in old tunnels, isolation is aspirational. Moisture migrates. It finds junction boxes, it creeps along cable jackets, it condenses in places with temperature gradients. Signal anomalies often precede more obvious structural problems, not because signals cause instability, but because signals are sensitive to the same environment that undermines concrete and steel.
A wet tunnel is a corroding tunnel. A corroding tunnel is a weakening tunnel. When engineers were asked to explain the anomalies, they offered standard possibilities: insulation breakdown, ground faults, aging equipment. These explanations were plausible. They were also incomplete because they did not account for concentration. A localized environment was causing localized failures. That environment was not being described accurately in formal terms. The station itself, meanwhile, continued to function. Trains stopped, doors opened, riders moved through without noticing the deeper narrative. The daily act of commuting has a numbing effect. People stand under stained ceilings and accept them. They hear drips and assume it is normal. In New York, it often is normal. But normal is not the same as safe. Normal is only what persists. The early warnings became hard to ignore when maintenance intervals compressed. Work that had been scheduled quarterly became monthly. Work that had been scheduled monthly became weekly. When you see the same crew returning to the same wall, the same drain, the same segment of track, you begin to recognize that the tunnel is consuming labor, consuming attention, consuming money in a way that cannot be sustained. Transit authorities respond to unsustainable consumption by narrowing public exposure. They start with partial closures, platform restrictions, signage that directs riders away from certain areas. They may increase train speeds through the station to reduce dwell time or reduce stopping patterns. They may run trains express through a problematic station, not because the station is unsafe to pass, but because stopping adds stress. Doors open, people crowd, trains brake and accelerate, vibrations peak. Passing through is gentler than stopping. If you were a rider at 53rd Street in that phase, you might have experienced a new kind of neglect: lighting that was not replaced quickly, paint that peeled, certain stairwells closed temporarily, signs that were less informative than they should have been. These are not just budget issues, they are symptoms of withdrawal. The system begins to act as if the station is already gone. The deeper technical concern was the tunnel lining's relationship to water pressure. In saturated ground, water exerts hydrostatic pressure against the structure. Waterproofing systems are designed to resist it, but waterproofing deteriorates. If cracks form, water pressure can force water through, and if fine material is present, it can carry that material into the tunnel. The tunnel becomes a collection point. The ground, slowly, becomes less supportive. At this stage, instability is no longer a theoretical risk. It becomes an operational variable. Engineers begin to ask different questions. Not, can we fix it, but can we safely operate while we fix it? And then, eventually, can we justify keeping it open at all? The decision to shut down a station is rarely immediate. It is usually preceded by an internal shift in language. Monitor becomes mitigate. Mitigate becomes restrict. Restrict becomes prepare for closure. Workers close to the corridor later described a period when the station felt unusually quiet even when trains ran. Not quiet in sound, but quiet in human presence. Supervisors visited more often. Inspectors walked the platform with clipboards more often. Work lights were left set up. Equipment carts lingered at the ends of the platform. The station became a place where the system was watching itself. That self-watching is one of the most disturbing aspects of infrastructure failure. The city, in a sense, becomes aware of its own fragility, but only in pockets, only in the areas where someone has reason to look closely. Elsewhere, life continues. Above ground, people shop, eat, argue, plan. Below ground, a tunnel is being measured, patched, measured again. A slow experiment in whether the ground will accept the structure. And beneath even that, there is the unspoken fact that if the tunnel failed, it would not fail in a report. It would fail in motion, with people inside it, with the weight of trains and the complacency of routine pressing against something that was no longer certain. When the tunnel's condition begins to affect operations, the story changes tone without changing vocabulary. The notices to riders remain routine. The closures remain for repairs. The language stays calm, but the decisions become sharper and the consequences more intimate. The darkest period at 53rd Street Station was not defined by a single day. It was defined by a sequence of incidents that did not individually justify public panic, but collectively suggested a corridor becoming unreliable in ways that exceeded ordinary decay. First came the unplanned slow orders, train speed reductions through the station and its approaches. Slow orders are common in New York. They are used for track defects, signal work, structural inspections. Riders experience them as delays. Workers experience them as admissions. A slow order is a statement that the system no longer trusts itself at full speed in a specific place. Then came the repeated, localized power interruptions, not full blackouts, but momentary drops and flickers in platform lighting and tunnel fixtures, the kind that make a station feel suddenly deeper. Electrical issues in tunnels often trace back to water. Water finds conduits. It compromises insulation. It causes ground faults. It trips breakers. The system resets. The lights return. The event is over. And yet it leaves a residue, the memory of a platform momentarily lit by emergency fixtures, faces briefly illuminated in a different color temperature, the sense that the station has an alternate state it can fall into at any time.
The most disturbing reports, however, came from workers assigned to overnight inspection windows. These were not tourists or thrill seekers. They were people with keys, permits, and tasks. They were trained to walk tunnels, to note defects, to stay calm around machinery in darkness. They described hearing water moving where no water should have been moving, not drips, not trickles. A sound like a shallow stream behind the wall, intermittent, as if pressure was building and releasing through a constriction. In a tunnel, that sound can be benign, water in a drain line, or it can be an omen, water traveling through soil, carrying material with it. There were also accounts of fine sediment accumulating in certain track bed areas after nights with no obvious leak increase. Sediment is not supposed to appear without transport. If it appears, it means the tunnel is receiving material from somewhere. The question is, from where? From within the structure as concrete degrades, or from outside as soil migrates. Concrete dust and soil can look similar in dim tunnel light. Determining the difference requires sampling, lab work, time. Time was a resource the system did not have. On several occasions, crews reportedly found hairline cracks that had grown noticeably over short intervals. Crack growth is not inherently catastrophic, but when cracks propagate in a consistent direction, when they cluster near joints or transitions, they become a story of stress. In a tunnel, stress is often a story of movement. The incidents escalated when a train operator reported an unusual lurch on approach, an abrupt change in ride quality that could not be explained by normal track irregularities. The operator filed a report. Inspectors followed. They measured. They adjusted. The next train passed, and the lurch was less pronounced, but it did not disappear completely. It returned sporadically, as if the track alignment was responding to something beneath it that changed with load. In the language of rail, this is a deeply unsettling phenomenon. Rails are expected to behave predictably under load. When they do not, it suggests that the structure beneath them is not providing consistent support. During this period, the station's human environment changed. Staff presence increased in ways riders might not consciously register. More uniformed personnel at odd hours, more maintenance crews visible at platform ends, more equipment staged behind temporary barriers. Certain platform sections were sometimes cordoned off with little explanation. Riders were directed to different car positions to board, as if the station's usable length had shrunk. The station began to feel like a place being slowly quarantined. There were also these smaller accounts, the kind that never reach official logs.
A cleaner who refused to work alone in the far end of the platform because the wall there felt wet in the air, even when it was dry to the touch. A track worker who insisted on carrying an extra headlamp battery specifically for this location. An electrician who began to refer to a particular junction box as the box that doesn't stay fixed because moisture returned no matter how thoroughly it was sealed. None of these are supernatural. They are human adaptations to an environment that has begun to behave outside expected parameters. The horror is not in the claims themselves. It is in the fact that multiple people with different roles and different temperaments began to adjust their behavior in the same direction, toward caution, toward avoidance, toward speed. At some point, the corridor required not just reactive repairs, but structural intervention. Additional bracing, more aggressive grouting, perhaps localized reinforcement of the lining. Structural intervention in an active subway environment is complicated. Work windows are short, space is limited, ventilation is constrained. Every tool vibration is itself a stress. Every drill hole is a new pathway for water, if not sealed perfectly. The act of fixing can worsen what it is trying to fix. If the station was ultimately demolished, it suggests that intervention was either insufficient or deemed too costly relative to expected benefit. Demolition implies a decision to remove surface and station elements, entrances, mezzanines, ancillary structures, so that the system no longer had to maintain the public interface. But the tunnel itself cannot be demolished in a city like New York without extraordinary measures. More often, it is sealed, stabilized as best as possible, and left as a managed void. The darkest period likely culminated in a final incident that forced the closure. Such incidents are often framed publicly as safety concerns, without detail. Internally, they might be described more precisely: a sudden increase in water inflow, a measurable shift in a structural element, a partial failure of a lining segment, a significant ground fault event, a track geometry deviation beyond tolerance.
What is most disturbing is not the incident itself, but the delay between recognition and closure. In large systems, recognition is often distributed. One person notices one thing, another notices another. The system does not know until enough signals align, and even then, it may continue operating while plans are made, because shutting down a station affects thousands of lives and triggers political consequences. During that delay, people continue to stand on the platform. They continue to wait for trains. They lean on columns. They read phones. They do not know that the tunnel is being treated as an active question. When closure finally comes, it is rarely dramatic. A station closes with signage, service changes, locked gates. Riders are rerouted. The city absorbs the change. A few articles may appear, then attention moves on. The demolition afterward is quieter still. Demolition of a station interface can happen incrementally. Entrances sealed, stairways removed, street-level structures dismantled. Over time, the surface forgets what it once connected to. A sidewalk is repoured, a new fence goes up, a building rises. The station becomes a negative space. Yet the tunnel in the ground remains part of the city's hidden inventory. It is a space with a history of stress and water, a space that once held people and now holds only air, cables, and whatever measures were taken to stabilize it. It becomes a place the system remembers only in restricted documents and in the habits of workers who still pass nearby. In horror, people often imagine abandonment as empty silence. In infrastructure, abandonment is rarely silent. Even sealed spaces carry noise: the distant vibration of trains in adjacent tunnels, the hum of electrical systems, the periodic pulse of pumps. A closed station can still resonate. It can still collect water. It can still shift. It can still demand attention, even without passengers.
The accounts from the final months of 53rd Street Station describe an environment that felt increasingly mechanical and less human, as if the station were no longer a civic space, but a worksite with a transit function temporarily attached. That transformation is subtle but profound. A public place becomes a technical problem. People become variables to be managed away from risk. And then, at last, the people are removed entirely. After the station closed, the city above it continued with the indifferent efficiency that makes New York appear immortal. Service maps changed, announcements became habitual, riders learned alternate routes. The absence of a station is easy to accept when the system offers other paths. In a network, redundancy can conceal loss. What remained was not a ruin in the romantic sense. There were no grand abandoned halls open to the public, no dramatic vistas of decay. The station's demolition ensured that the surface would not carry a visible scar. The entrances were eliminated. The stairways were removed or sealed. The station stopped being a place you could stand and prove existed. The horror of the aftermath is administrative. A station reduced to a set of retired asset numbers, archived maintenance logs, a few lines in internal correspondence, and the memories of people whose work required them to see what riders never saw. In a city where history is often preserved through visible remnants, demolition is a kind of erasure that feels deliberate, even when it is practical. The phrase tunnel instability lingers because it is not a conclusion, it is a condition. If a station is closed due to instability, the instability does not end because the public no longer stands nearby. The ground continues, water continues, load from surrounding streets continues. Adjacent tunnels, utilities, foundations, all continue to interact with the same shifting environment. In many cases, a closed station becomes a managed cavity. It may be filled partially with concrete. It may be reinforced and sealed. It may be converted into an emergency egress space, a utility corridor, or simply a dead zone behind locked doors. The exact fate is often not publicly detailed because it intersects with security and operational planning. What the public sees is nothing. What the system maintains is something. This creates a peculiar form of silence, the silence of ongoing work in a place no one is allowed to witness. Workers who remain in the system often speak of closed spaces as if they have personalities, not because they believe in hauntings, but because humans assign identity to environments that repeatedly cause trouble. A tunnel segment that always leaks becomes that wet spot. A sealed station becomes the old stop. These phrases carry more information than they seem. They are shorthand for risk, for inconvenience, for the memory of nights spent under work lights with water dripping into buckets. Over time, the stories sharpen. They lose nuance and gain edge. A station that required constant patching becomes the one that wouldn't hold. A tunnel that produced unexplained sediment becomes the one that ate the ground. The language becomes more vivid because the official language remains sterile. People fill the gap. In the case of 53rd Street Station, the most lasting psychological presence reported by workers was not fear of collapse, but a persistent sense of wrongness associated with that corridor, a sense that the tunnel did not behave like other tunnels. That wrongness was expressed through practical habits. Certain crews preferred to schedule work there with extra personnel to avoid leaving a single person alone at the far end of a work zone, to double-check gas readings, even when no gas issue had been documented. They did these things not because of superstition, but because the station's history taught them that the environment could change quickly without warning. The fear in such places is not of ghosts, it is of delayed consequences. Infrastructure failure often reveals itself after the fact. A void grows behind a lining and remains invisible for months. A crack propagates slowly, then accelerates. A leak becomes a washout. A corrosion point becomes a fracture. The system's most unsettling feature is that it can appear normal until the moment it is not. That is why workers carry memory differently than riders. Riders interact with the system as a service. Workers interact with it as a material reality. When a station is demolished, it becomes harder for that memory to anchor itself. There is no place to point to and say, here, this is where it happened. The memory becomes portable, passed in conversation, embedded in training warnings, referenced obliquely in safety briefings. The documentary record of such events is usually incomplete for another reason: liability. When a piece of infrastructure is closed due to instability, the question of responsibility becomes sensitive. Was the tunnel design sufficient? Were inspections adequate? Were warnings acted upon promptly? Did surface development contribute? Did budget constraints delay intervention? These are questions that invite litigation, political conflict, reputational damage. Institutions tend to manage such questions carefully, often by limiting the specificity of public statements. As a result, the public-facing narrative collapses into a single phrase: instability. It is a word that implies technical certainty while concealing technical debate. Instability can mean many things: settlement, heave, lining deformation, water pressure, soil migration, structural fatigue. The word does not tell you which. The lasting psychological presence of a closed station is also shaped by absence from the rider's mental map. New Yorkers build internal geographies based on stations. When a station disappears, it leaves a gap that most people quickly forget. But the tunnel still occupies physical space. It still exists as a constraint on other projects, as a factor in future construction, as a void that must be accounted for in subsurface mapping. That means the station's ghost, in the most realistic sense, is bureaucratic. It is a line on a utility map that prompts a contractor to ask for clarification. It is a note in a geotechnical report, existing abandoned subway structure. It is a warning flag when someone proposes a new foundation nearby. It is a silent requirement that the city remember what it has tried to erase. There are moments, years later, when the past resurfaces, not as story, but as problem. A sinkhole appears on a street, and investigators trace it to water undermining the ground. They review old records. They discover the abandoned structure nearby. They ask whether it is contributing. They may never find a definitive answer, because underground systems rarely provide clean causality. They provide correlations, plausible mechanisms, risk assessments. The horror of 53rd Street Station, then, is not contained in a single catastrophe. It is contained in the slow recognition that the city's foundations are negotiated daily with forces that do not care about schedules or budgets. A station is built as if permanence is possible. It is maintained as if control is possible. It is closed when those assumptions fail. And even then, the failure is not resolved. It is managed, sealed, hidden, and left to the long-term stewardship of a system that has thousands of other vulnerabilities competing for attention. When you stand on a Brooklyn sidewalk today, where a demolished station once had an entrance, you may feel nothing. That is the point. The city prefers that you feel nothing. The surface has been repaired, repoured, repurposed. There is no plaque. There is no official invitation to remember. But under the street, the tunnel remains part of the city's anatomy. It is a controlled void in an uncontrolled medium. It is a place where water once insisted on being heard, where cracks once grew faster than expected, where the system's confidence was eroded by repeated contradictions between what instruments recorded and what bodies felt. In a functioning city, most people never have to think about that. They travel over it, live above it, build on top of it. They trust that the ground is solved. The story of 53rd Street Station suggests that the ground is never solved. It is only temporarily convinced. That is what gives the aftermath its quiet weight. Not the idea that something lurks below, but the knowledge that the city's most essential spaces are maintained through constant vigilance, and that vigilance is finite. The system chooses where to look closely and where to look away. A station closed for instability is a place where the system was forced to look and then forced to retreat. The retreat is what remains. And the next time a train passes through the adjacent corridor, if it does, the vibration will still travel through the same earth that once refused to hold its shape. The sound will still propagate through the same materials. The pressure cycles will still occur. The water will still search for paths. A demolished station is not a disappearance. It is a decision to stop acknowledging a problem in public while continuing to live with it underground, where living with it requires fewer words.